Okay, good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Tuesday evening lecture series. This presentation is being recorded and once processed will be uploaded to our YouTube channel for anyone to access at a later date. If you have any questions for the speakers, please type your questions in the chat and I will do my best to relay the questions to our speaker at an appropriate time. Or you can wait till the presentation is over, and when the question answer session begins, feel free to ask your question. Tonight's lecture is an introduction to Empidonax Flycatchers and their identification, and is being presented by Cin-Ty and Andy Birch. Unfortunately, Andy Birch is unwell today, so he's not able to join us. Cin-Ty is a professor of geology at Rice University in Houston, Texas, but has been interested in studying and drawing birds for many decades. Andrew Birch is an avid birder and has spent much of his time illustrating birds for various identification articles and books. Together, Leo and Birch have pursued many of the most challenging identifications, such as loons, female orioles, pewees, dowitchers, and pipits. Their new field guide to North American flycatchers, which, full disclosure, I have pre-ordered, focuses on the identification of Empidonax and pewees. They are currently working on another guide to the kingbirds and Myarchus flycatchers. And with that, Cin-Ty, you have the stage.
Great. Let's see here. Need to find, where did it go here? Here we go. Okay. Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity to talk about flycatchers. And yes, Andy was supposed to join us, but he's sick right now, so it'll just be me. But I want to really emphasize that this was a huge team effort. All the illustrations are his, and really what makes the field guide is the beautiful illustrations, not all the text that I put in. But yeah, so this book is coming out soon, and it's on flycatchers of North America, and focused on Empidonax and pewees. It's going to be a 3-volume series. The second volume is Myarchus and kingbirds, and then the third one will be all of this put together, plus more flycatchers in Mexico and the United States in there, so it'll be a bigger version. And let me just tell you a little bit about how we got here. Got the laser pointer here. So Andy and I, we actually, he's in California, I'm in Texas, but we met in California when we were in college, chasing rare birds. And he comes from the UK. I come from Southern California originally, and we just somehow got interested in looking at these difficult or challenging IDs like shorebirds or dowitchers, pewees. And we found a really good way to work together where I write and he illustrates, and we work together on that. And so we've done a lot of articles, but never a book until just now. And we've been working on flycatchers for a very long time, just off and on, because we both have day jobs. I'm a geologist, and Andy works in the animation industry down in Los Angeles. And when COVID hit, we thought, well, it's now or never to do this project. And so that's how we got here. And probably most of you know about flycatchers, particularly Empidonax. It's one of the last frontiers of field ornithology in North America. They look all very similar. They're very difficult to distinguish. And, if back in the 60s, one would have said you couldn't identify any of them by sight. But the birding community, from the professionals to the non-professionals, like presumably all of us, I consider myself a non-professional, just going out, looking at the birds, studying them as a hobby, we have made quite a lot of advances as a community over the decades. And so a lot of them can be identified by sight, but they're still, of course, very difficult. And some of them are still very challenging. And of course, sound is a very good way to identify these flycatchers. So our goal with this book wasn't really to train everyone to be an expert Empid guy. Andy and I still make mistakes ourselves, and sometimes you will get a photo or we're out in the field. There's some birds that just defy identification, particularly silent birds. So our goal wasn't to turn one into an expert. Our goal was actually to kind of train one how to look at a flycatcher so that you learn faster on how to identify them. And by doing that, you can learn to be a better birder in general. So before I get to flycatchers, I'm just put this up of the egrets. It's a cattle egret, snow egret, great egrets, of course. And I show this in my beginning bird classes to kind of introduce bird identification. And we often rely on field marks like color or color patterns. But this one was just to show that actually a lot of how we identify birds is by size, shape, maybe color contrast. Great egret, it's large, it's got a large yellow bill. Snow egret has a black bill, but very narrow and straight dagger-like bill. And then the cattle egret has a wider but shorter bill and a shorter neck. And so these are really structural features. And with Empids or flycatchers, a lot of the IDs are based on these structural features that are very subtle. But I show you this because you are already doing it. You're already looking at structural cues, even when you just start birding, and the human eye can see it. We have very good eyes and a very good way of detecting these things. And so this talk is really to kind of hone that skill that you already have and help you take it to another level. And I show this one too, that shorebirds, a lot of identifying shorebirds is based on structure. You got the curlew with the long decurved bill, godwit with a slightly upturned bill, plovers with a short stubby bill, and your peeps, your caligerous sandpipers are small shorebirds with a thin, fine-tipped bill. And so we all can see that. So that gets me to back to Empids. It's about holistic birding, and the things we want to focus on are things like shape and proportions and contrast, voice, of course, habitat, behavior, seasonal status, where you try to bring in the greater knowledge, bring everything in. And again, you may not, when you're in the field, know what the bird is, but if you think about these things out there, then when you go back home and start looking through the references, you've thought about this, you've recorded it out in the field, and so you have the right information to go back to evaluate, to narrow down your identification. So it's really what to look for, what to listen for, what to look for when you see this Empid, this brown bird that's very difficult to identify. And so flycatchers, they are actually one of the largest families, is Tyrannidae, of birds in the world. I think there's like 450 species or so. They're all from the Americas, mostly in South America, Central America. But there's a group that migrates up in the neotropical migrants. They migrate up into North America. And that group includes the Empidonax, and to some extent the pewees. And we decided to tackle this project in pieces. So we did Empidonax and pewees, and then we'll do the others in subsequent volumes, because there was so much information that we had to provide. So this is the cover of our book, and apparently it's shipped out today to those who had ordered already. And it includes all these particular species. Tufted flycatcher is not Empidonax or Contopus, but pewee, but it superficially looks very similar to Empids, so we put them in there for completeness. But it includes everything that's been recorded in the United States and Canada. So let me just start with this series of photos. These are Empidonax flycatchers, and some of you may already know what these are, but even if you do, you'll obviously admit that they really look similar. They're all dull. They all seem to have some sort of eye ring. They all have wing bars. They all have a tail, a relatively long tail. And so to the untrained eye, they might look very similar. To the trained eye, you might see some differences. But the thing with is, for example, differences in color, right? One is the middle one, it's kind of grayish. And then we got one that's orangish or greenish to the right, and so forth. And I'm not going to worry about what species these are, because I don't think that's important for now. I just want to get across how to look at these birds. And so I purposely gray toned these. And when you put them into gray tones, you'll see now they look even more similar. And the reason why I did that is the problem is when you're out in the field, color is a very, very variable feature. It depends on the lighting conditions. It depends on your own perception of color, and one person's yellowish, maybe some other person's greenish, brown may look gray to somebody else. All our eyes are slightly different, and you have a flycatcher out there, you don't know what it is, and there are 10 people out there, and each of you basically see a different thing or a different color, and that becomes, of course, a problem. So I actually want to de-emphasize color. I mean, in some cases, color is a great field mark at the extremes, but in general, there's a lot of overlapping color, and particularly lighting, different lighting conditions. And so if you de-emphasize color as the field mark, sort of a traditional field mark, what do you have to go by? And so some of the things are structural. For example, we call this part, this is the wing, and these are the flight feathers. This is the secondary panel, and this is the primary panel, the primaries, the outer wing, and how far the primaries project out from the secondaries and tertials is different compared for different species. You can compare it relative to the length of the tail, right? This one has a short primary projection, long tail. This one has a short primary projection, but a short tail. This is somewhat intermediate right here. So it's these overall differences in shape that we want to focus on. We also want to focus on what I call, maybe you can't see the color, but you can see contrasts. So for example, in this bird to the right, the contrast between the chest and the back or the mantle is, you can see in this grayscale, it's not a strong contrast, similar intensity and color. Same thing with this one. And then you go to the one on the left, it looks like it's clearly got a bright white chest and then a darker mantle. And if we put in color, it would be greenish yellow, but even without the color, you can see that there's a strong contrast between the chest or underparts and the upper parts. And so if you can train your eyes to notice those details, that's very useful. Same thing with the wing bars, right? They unfortunately all have wing bars, but the brightness of the wing bars, which you can measure relative to the mantle or the ground color of the wings, is different. Very bold contrast down to weak contrast all the way to the right. So the goals that I want to get to in this presentation is how to look and listen to a bird, to a flycatcher, but to a bird in general, actually. And then ultimately how to calibrate your eyes and ears to these subtle differences. And that we also have some common terminology that we can all agree on. And for example, I can have two people come to me and they saw the same bird, and one will say, oh, it has a long tail, the other has a short tail, but it's all relative. So with flycatchers, we have to establish some sort of scale. And so our book focuses a lot on that. The first parts of the book basically gives you something like this. These are Andy's beautiful illustrations here. And this is about bill shape, and it would different examples of bill shape or size. And so you can go like a gray flycatcher up here would have a long bill, and a Hammond's flycatcher is a small bill. And so when you see a flycatcher, you just open up the book and look down this and say, does it match the one at the top or the one at the bottom? And then we're all talking the same language. So here's some photos to illustrate the effect. Look at how long the bill is of the gray flycatcher, and then the Hammond, the least and Hammond's flycatchers have smaller bills. There's actually an interesting difference in even though they're both small, the shape of the bill and Hammond's and least are different. Hammond's is narrower, and least is more convex at the culmen there. Very subtle features, but you can see if you take some time to look carefully, you will be able to see them. So what I'm going to do is go through essentially these scales, in a sense, how to these comparison charts, how to determine what is a long bill or short bill sizes and so forth. And so I'm starting with the more obvious sort of field marks, and we'll work our way to the more non-traditional, but actually sometimes more powerful field mark. So here's the lower mandible color. We talk a lot about that for some species. For example, gray is completely orange below, and Hammond's is dark below, one of the few that's completely dark below. And so if you can get these extremes, it can be helpful. Of course, orange lower mandible, you can see a whole bunch of the birds have that feature. So the color of the mandible doesn't rule out a lot of things unless you have something that's completely dark. Of course, one of the challenges with mandible color is, again, lighting conditions matter a lot. In bad light, in the shade, unfortunately, the lower mandible is on the lower part, so it's always in the shade. You sometimes have to get a very good look to know whether it's orange or it's dark. Sometimes they all look dark. Moving on, we can look at another one of these traditional field marks. All of the flycatchers have some sort of eye ring, ranging from what we would call a very thin or indistinct one, in the case of the trails flycatchers, all the way to a bold and what I call crisp eye ring. Very fine, crisp eye ring there that you'd see in Acadian yellow-bellied, to one that's kind of a fuzzy but bold eye ring that would be like a least flycatcher in your area, and then the characteristic one with a teardrop eye shape. Caution is always necessary when looking at eye rings, because sometimes an eye ring can look messy when the feathers are ruffled, or sometimes it can not be very apparent in a worn bird. So you have to keep those in mind. And so you probably can get a sense of where I'm going, is that we unlike more of the most birds, we're going to be using a combination of field marks to identify flycatchers rather than one or two. So one of the field marks that we talk about a lot, or has been talked about a lot, is tail length, relative tail length. And we have this comparison chart just to make sure that, again, we're all talking the same language. And so here, short would be for Hammond's and least, and a gray would have long tail. And of course, flycatchers all have long tails compared to sparrows and warblers. But within the flycatcher group, we can distinguish between those that have a shorter and a longer tail. This one is another feature that is in already a lot of field guides called the primary projection. It's this distance that the primaries project out beyond the tertials relative to the length of the tertials or the secondaries here. And some birds have very long projection, and these actually typically are the birds that migrate very long distances, so need longer wings. So Acadian, it winters down in South America, yellow-bellied as well. Hammond's migrates all the way up to Alaska, whereas something like Least, that's our eastern hardwood forests, and then they go down to like Mexico, so not that far. So they have a short primary extension. But you should be able to tell the difference between these extremes. Sometimes, of course, the intermediate ones are a little bit more challenging. So here's some photos, examples of primary projection. Here's the Acadian, which you'll get, and Least, both which you'll get in your neck of the woods. But look at the saber-like projection of the primary tips, almost as long as the secondaries if you measure it from the end to the lower wing bar, whereas the Least flycatcher, it's shorter than this length right here. So we call that a medium. Then you go to gray. Well, Least can be both, but gray is at the other extreme, where here's the projection, very small compared to the length of the whole secondaries right here. So you always have to compare to some reference there. So we look at relative proportions. Now, our book does introduce somewhat new field marks, or at least ones that haven't been talked about so much, and we did a lot of analysis to see how robust they are. But wing bar contrast is one. Again, they all have wing bars, but what you want to look at is the color of the wing bars relative to the color of the back or the ground color of the wings. So something like this, a yellow-bellied, almost has white wing bars that stand out boldly against the back, whereas gray, dusky, willow, you can see the wing bars here barely stand out relative to the back. So that would be a weak contrast. And then, of course, you have intermediate birds here. And with photos, you can see that. Look at the Least and the yellow-bellied, how bright those wing bars are compared to the back. And then you go all the way to the gray, you can barely see the wing bars. They don't pop out at you, and willow is somewhere intermediate. So that's how to look at wing bars and the contrast. As I alluded to earlier on in the introduction, the contrast between the under parts and the upper parts is also important. Here, Andy is illustrated with the birds facing us turned, but you can compare, say, the chest or the throat to the cheeks here. So strong, like a Least or Acadian, they almost have a whitish front, and then they have a darker cheek and mantle. And go to the other extreme, the Hammond's flycatcher, which does vagrate to the East Coast in the fall. The chest is the same color as the crown and the face. So you see there's no contrast here. So again, we don't focus on color, we focus on relative contrast. And here's some good examples. This one, it's a terrible photo. I did that on purpose. Well, I didn't purposely take a terrible photo, but I picked a terrible photo to show that look how bright that chest is compared to the rest of the body and the cheek. It maybe is accentuated by the lighting conditions though. But here's an Acadian, white chest contrasting with a darker back. But then you go out here, look at the Hammonds, very weak contrast, dark chest, dark back, gray is somewhere in between. And the yellow-bellied, although it's completely different color than the Hammonds, it's kind of a greenish yellow, but the chest and the mantle are both greenish yellow, so minimal contrast. Of course, beware of backlit birds. This looks white because the sun is sort of shining through the feathers there, so you got to watch the bird from different angles. Now, another potentially useful feature, or actually is very useful for some birds, not all, is well, actually the next two. This one is about crown shape. The obvious ones are the Cordilleran Flycatcher and Pacific Slope and the pewees. They have a crested, almost pointed appearance. But from then on, you can get some with a slight peak, a flat head, and a round head. And so pay attention to that. Here you can see the roundness of a least, the flatness of a gray flycatcher, the crested of a western, the peaked or even crested of an Acadian. There's overlap between all of these, but again, they have to be used in conjunction with other field marks. This field mark is not discussed much, but it can be very useful. I call it the forehead angle, and that is you take the bill, the culmen there, that angle, and then the angle, or put a line or tangent to the forehead, and just look at that angle. And of course, we're not asking you to go measure these angles from photos or measure them out in the field when you're just out birding, but you can see this. Even though you think it may be too technical, you can actually see it. So for example, in the case of a Hammond's, it's got a very steep forehead right there where the forehead meets the bill. Whereas go to Acadian, then you have a very, or gray and gray, a shallow forehead. You can see that here. See the shallow forehead, the slope of the Acadian, and compare that to the Hammond's. Right where it meets the bill, it kind of steepens very quickly. And Hammond's is the only one that has such a steep forehead. And then the really shallow, only gray and Acadian. It doesn't help with those who are intermediate because there's a lot in there, but it can help sort out some extremes. If you're trying to identify a vagrant Hammond's, or try to distinguish it from a least out in Maryland in the fall, this can be a hint that a steep forehead that you got a Hammond's. Tail width, also potentially useful. The tail width is kind of how wide the tail is, and the pewees all have wide tails. But when you get to the Empids, it turns out things like Acadian and the Trails flycatcher also have wide tails, whereas the other flycatchers tend to have narrow tails, even narrowing towards the base of the body right here, whereas the wide tails tend to be straight edged. They don't narrow towards the body. And this can be useful. Sometimes least and Acadian flycatcher can look very similar if you don't get a good look, but Acadian has a wide, fattish tail, and least has a narrow tail. And typically, those with wider tails also tend to have shorter tails proportionately. And you can see that here. This is alder flycatcher, kind of a wide tail, Acadian, sort of wide tail. But then take a look at the Hammond's and least. It looks like you can twist that tail off the body very easily. So they're very narrow and even narrow towards the body right here. Wing panel contrast. This is the contrast between the primaries and secondaries. So the wings are made up of the inner wing, which are secondaries, we call them secondaries, and then the primaries are the outer wing, flight feathers. And typically the secondaries have pale edges to them. So if you look from a distance, they look pale. We call that a panel, a wing panel, a secondary wing panel. And then the primaries, sometimes they have pale edges, and sometimes they don't. And the ones that don't will tend to have darker primaries and the lighter secondaries. We call that a strong wing panel contrast. And then the weak wing panel contrast. Good examples here, showing the extremes, is a least flycatcher with very strong, so see the white edges to the secondaries and no white edges to the primaries. So we call this a strong wing panel contrast. Very good for separating least from Hammond's. Then you go to gray. It's got pale edges on the primaries and the secondaries, so there's very minimal contrast between the two panels. And behavior. Behavior turns out not to be that useful, or you have to be very careful of it, because all of these birds flick their tails and wings, at least all the Empidonax. The pewees never flick their tails or wings. They may pump the tail a little bit, but so that certainly can help you separate out pewees from Empidonax. But within the Empidonax, this is an Acadian to the right. It flicks its tail there. But in some cases, like the gray flycatcher, you watch this again, it drops its tail slowly and then brings it up back in line with its back. So it's a slow tail dropper, whereas you go to the other Empids, it actually lifts its tail up first and then brings it down. See that? Up and then down, and does it fast. That's what we call a tail flick, as opposed to a tail drop. Takes some practice to see it. Now with YouTube, there's plenty of videos out there to practice. Holistic birding isn't just about taking a photograph and taking it home and analyzing it. I think you really get the best experience when you look at the surroundings. What type of habitat is it in? How is it foraging? In the case of Empids, breeding grounds matter a lot. Is it in a dry pine forest? Is it in a boreal forest? Is it in sagebrush habitats? Is it in a really shaded area? Pacific slope flycatchers like to be in these riparian shaded environments, whereas say dusky would be out here in the or open forests. Least would be on the edges of forests. Acadians will be in the forests. Broadleaf forests, not so much the coniferous forests. And so those are subtle cues or clues to whether you have your ID right. And these flycatchers, even in migration, when they're out of their regular habitats, will tend to associate with something that looks like their microhabitat. For example, the Western flycatchers and Acadian, they like to be in shade. You won't see them sitting right out in the open. They'll be hidden, where they're in the understory. Yellow-bellied flycatcher will be low and also in the understory, whereas Hammonds might be on the edge. Least might also be on the edge a little. So they're kind of loyal to even their microhabitats on their breeding grounds there. So pay attention to habitat, macro habitat, and the micro habitat, but also pay attention to the seasonal status and range. And so we painstakingly made these maps, and these maps are range maps. They show, of course, the breeding range, and the wintering range. This is Acadian, but we also show migratory routes, both in spring and in fall, the directions. And we have these contours here that kind of show you when they arrive, like the first spring migrants. And so out where you all are, Acadian flycatcher will start to come, in mid-April. And then you'll see these bar charts, they depart probably by end of August, early September. Most are gone by then. We also, these migration routes, do they fly across the Gulf of Mexico or do they go around the Gulf of Mexico? All things that we want to talk about. Now, this one is the least flycatcher on the right. This one is showing you that least, Acadian is an early migrant because it breeds in the southeastern deciduous forests, where it's already blossoming and leafing. Here in Texas, we got insects already all out. The flowers are coming out, but most of the other flycatchers breed further north, and so they have to wait until it gets warm enough that the plants start to bloom and the insects start to have things to feed on. So they come later. And so they're usually coming at end of April, if not even early May, in the East Coast. In Texas, yellow-bellied flycatcher, alder and willow, we only start seeing them in May. So if you identify a willow or alder, or especially an alder flycatcher in mid-April in Texas, it would be suspect because most of the times they don't get here that early. And that's, of course, all controlled by the ecology of our continent and how it changes, the timing changes with how far north you go in the food supply. And when you're paying attention to flycatchers, always listen for vocalizations. Try to record them. Your smartphone these days are good enough as a recorder. Just record them. And it turns out, in most cases, the calls are quite diagnostic. In the book, we have in each species account these spectrograms of this is frequency versus time. And in a sense, it's like a musical clef, right? This would be the scale, and this would be time. And the shape of this gives you a sense of what it may sound like. For example, this helps you visualize the sound. So this is
bank statement,
like that, and then a pip. This would be a sharp pip. This would be a sweet, more like a Pacific slope, and then this would be like a birch, like a little buzzy type of call. And so this is just getting you to visualize the calls to help you learn them and remember what you hear out in the field. And once you do that, then you can start to hear the very subtle differences between all of these whits. Hammond's has a pip, but Gray has a very sharp whit. Dusky has a more liquid whit. It's a little broader, a little longer, and Willow has a hollow whit when it does it, somewhere between a whit and a pip. So pay attention to the spectrograms there. Okay, so that's the first part of the book, which is really giving you a scale, just training you how to see a bird, how to listen to a bird, how to see the bigger picture, and bring all of that information together. And the goal is not to memorize all of them, but just to know what to look for when you see the bird before it flies off, without you making notes of the key features. But the rest of the book is about dedicated to each species, how to identify them, and all the details of their migratory status. And so I thought for this talk, we'll end with just going through a few flycatchers and pewees here to show you how it works. And let me start with pewees. I didn't really talk too much about pewees, but these are wood pewees. And the first thing to do is separate a wood pewee from an empid. And this right here is an eastern, this is a western wood pewee. But the pewees all have very long primary extensions, longer than any empid. So that's the first thing to look at. And they have shorter tails. See, this tail is not that long, and they're very fat, wide tails. And they have a peaked crest. So those are the things that I would focus on to separate a pewee from an impid. So you have to do that first. Of course, if you want to get into great detail separating eastern from western, then you have to look at more subtle cues, and our book goes into that in great detail. But I won't do that for now. We have a little part in there that talks about how to separate some of the pewees and flycatchers from non-flycatchers. Sometimes Hutton's vireo or ruby-crowned kinglet can superficially look like a flycatcher, but they have a very different shape to it. They're more horizontal. The ruby-crowned kinglet's the same, more horizontal appearance, shorter tail. So separate from, make sure you've got a flycatcher in the beginning, of course. So let me go through a few flycatchers that you may encounter. We're not going to go through all of them in the interest of time, just trying to give you a taste of how to do this. So this is the least flycatcher. And on the left, you can go back and look at this on the YouTube video. I'm not going to go through all of them, but it's there for reference. But just to point out a few things, like look at that incredibly strong contrast between the underparts, the upper parts, the medium primary projection, the relatively short and very narrow tail, the bright orange lower mandible. It's got an eye-ring, but the eye-ring is not uniform in thickness all around. I would call this a messy eye-ring. This particular bird almost looks like it has a teardrop, so you do have to be careful with that. But you could rule out Pacific slope or Cordilleran by this remarkable contrast, and also strong wing panel contrast here. And we have these spectrograms for you to look at in the book. I did not have the calls loaded onto this particular talk, so we'll skip that. But at least has a very strong, a sharp whit call that almost sounds like a yellow-rumped warbler, but not the myrtle that you have, but the Audubon's warbler out in the west. The other bird that you have in your neck of the woods, probably more inland, would be the Acadian flycatcher, and it's like the least, a very strong contrast between back and under parts. But where it differs from least is that the projection of the primary is much longer. Its eye-ring is not messy. It's uniform in thickness around, nice, bold, and crisp. Its bill is a bit longer, and it has a wider tail. And you can almost see, even though we're looking from the side, that you can still tell it has a wider tail, because the wider tail is kind of also give it an appearance of a thick tail right at the base. Their calls are distinctive for sure. Very distinctive call that you'll hear in the bottomland forests from very far away at dusk or dawn. So in the field guides, Andy has laid out these birds in the form of these plates. You have these maps here. This would be the Acadian flycatcher showing different postures there. But we have comparison plates of Acadian versus yellow-bellied and least, which are the ones that on the East Coasters are most likely to have to deal with, right? And we highlight the main differences, the length of the primaries, the projection, and the shapes of the primary tips here. That's a detail, but very important detail. And then the color contrasts and differences in the structure of the bird. We also, alder is one that may go through your area, more to the west though. These, of course, look incredibly similar to willow flycatchers, and so we've grouped them together in the book because of their similarities. And we do discuss how you separate them, and it's mostly by call. But to separate them from other flycatchers, you again look at width of tail, contrast between the chin and the face, and so forth. Thin eye ring, almost non-existent eye ring or indistinct eye ring. Yellow-bellied, one that passes through your region a little bit. Of course, the bright greenish yellow color is almost always in the east a sure way to identify the bird, but in warm birds or in bad lighting, it'd be tough. So then you focus on the boldness of the wing bars, strong wing panel contrast, right, and a very crisp eye ring. In the west, where Andy is and where I grew up, there we get, of course, the western flycatchers. This is a Cordilleran, but we always want to find our yellow-bellied flycatcher as a vagrant, and they look the same in terms of color. But one of the biggest differences is the boldness of the wing bars is much stronger on the yellow-bellied than on the westerns, and the wing panel contrast is weak. See here on the westerns, but strong in the yellow-bellied. Also, bill shape and crown shape are different. A little bit of a peak on western, yellow-bellied doesn't. We also, in their western flycatchers, Pacific slope to Cordilleran, they split that not too long ago, but these are their calls going from California all the way to Colorado, and you can see it's a complete gradual gradation. So maybe they're not different species. They're maybe we should lump them back together. You will lose the life bird, of course. And I think I'll end with two flycatchers now. The gray flycatcher out in the west, They don't vagrate to the east very much, but that it's got the longest bill of the empids and the flattest crown, sort of a really flat head, and long tail, the longest tail there. And habitat is very important. They'll be in the open environment. You'll never see them in the forest. They might be inside a shrub, but the shrub will be sort of an open shrub area, separated by open spaces. And here's Dusky. Looks like a gray because it's gray, but the bill is shorter. The wing bars and the wing panel contrast are just a little bit stronger than in gray, and a slightly longer primary projection. That being said, there will always be some Duskies that it's hard to tell. Is it a gray or dusky, or is a dusky a Hammond's Flycatcher? And that's when you really need to get vocalizations, record their call. And the last one, Hammond's Flycatcher. That's actually one of my favorite flycatchers, but generally straightforward to identify if you focus on, usually when you see a Hammond's, the birds that you're worried about are Hammond's, dusky, and least. And there for Hammond's, look for the long primary projection and the dark undermaned bill and the dark chest. And those three in combination are usually enough to clinch that you got a Hammond's, not somebody else. Hammond's has a very distinct call for the flycatchers. It has a pip call instead of a whip call. So more of Andy's plates, just we put them side by side. They look very similar. We were very worried, in the publication, the joke was that we could just paint the same bird because they all look similar and reproduce them 200 times. But you can see that they are slightly different in structure and so forth. So if you study them carefully, you'll see these subtle differences. Here's Hammond's, dusky, least, and so forth. And more comparisons between Hammond's, dusky, and gray. The structure of the gray is very different than that of the Hammond's, really long-tailed, for example. So I come back to this. This was the least flycatcher. This is the dusky, and this is the Pacific Slope flycatcher. I purposely come back to the grayscale image to remind us how we got here. And the goal of this whole talk was to help you see subtle differences in structure and contrast. And I hope you'll be able to take this new way of looking at birds, and not just for empids, but to look at all birds in this way. It'll make you a better birder. So I end with this. All of that is in our book. And if you have any questions, I'm more than happy to chat more. And feel free, you can also email me. I'm easy to find on the internet. And if you have photos that you don't know what they are, I'm always happy to, Andy and I are happy to provide some feedback. So thank you very much.
Awesome. Well, does anybody have any questions?
I can stop share here, I guess. Yeah.
Well, I definitely have a few questions. Can you talk a little bit more about body shape? Is body shape a good way to differentiate flycatchers from pewees or within flycatchers itself?
Yeah. So we kind of broke down body shape into things like the relative tail length, forehead, or the crown shape, forehead, angle, but all those together give you the perception of body shape. But the first one is like pewees, and which I didn't talk so much about in this particular lecture because interest in time. But the shapes of pewees are quite different than empids. Pewees are shorter tailed, wider tailed, very long primary projections. All the pewees, except for some of these Caribbean ones, but all the regular ones in the US have very long primary projection. They don't flick their tails, their wings, and they also appear to be a bulkier bird compared to the Empids. And then when you get to the Empids, yeah, they have a longer tail, and the tail is smaller, thinner than the pewee, and they have wing bars. They don't have, yeah. I think that shape is what I would focus on. And then within the Empids, separating from each other, I guess I didn't talk so much about it here, but in the book, in the species accounts, gray flycatcher is a slender bird, and that slenderness is accentuated by its long tail, or the perception of its slenderness. Whereas something like least flycatcher may appear like a sort of a dumpy bird, but you have to be careful. Birds, the size of the actual meat of the bird compared to its feathers. I don't know if you ever looked at these, but the actual body is much smaller than the outline of the feathers. So, birds will fluff up their feathers when it's cold, or they'll sleek it down when it's hot, and so the shape can change. But relative things like the length of the primaries and tail, those still hold.
Gotcha. I think what I've read in the past is that flycatchers are more rotund, while pewees have like a muscular chest but a very slim waist, like almost like a bodybuilder. I don't know how true that is,
that's right.
but,
Pewees, more barrel chested, and they from the chest all the way to the tail of the tip is kind of continuous like that. Whereas the flycatchers be like an egg, and you put a toothpick at the end of the egg for the tail. That might be an over exaggeration, but
yeah. Does anybody have a question to ask?
Yeah, how about it's a fascinating talk. One thing I was wondering whether if the posture of the bird, the typical posture of these birds at rest, is that indicative? I always felt that MPs tend to sit more horizontally, whereas pewees seem to sit more erectly. Can you tell anything out of posture?
Oh yeah. I think within the Empids, posture is probably not that great. But certainly between pewees and Empids, posture is a big deal. And just like what you said, the pewees, they're much more vertical birds, stiff. I get, that's the stiff feel. And then the flycatchers, a little bit more horizontal. They're still kind of vertical compared to all other birds, but within the Empids, compared to pewees, they are a little bit more horizontal. The other thing is the flycatchers. You have your bird, the tail is often cocked a little bit, and pewees, the tail is like straight with the back.
Yeah.
And then since the pewees sit up straight, it's further accentuated that stiffness to it.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Yeah, we don't have that so much in the beginning of the book, but within the individual species accounts, we talk a lot about posture. Posture is also helpful for separating even Western from Eastern wood pewees.
Mm-hmm.
It's funny here in the West, you would rarely ever mistake a Western wood pewee for, say, a Hammond's flycatcher. But out in the East, and that's because their postures are so different, even though they're both dark birds. But out in the East, Eastern wood pewee is very often mistaken for an Empid, and it's because Eastern wood pewee is it's got a little bit more contrast on the chest. It's got a little bolder wing bars in the Western wood pewee, and it often will hold its tail cocked down just a little bit, like an Empid. So, and I've only seen that problem in the East. We don't see that in the West as much.
Okay, thank you.
Anybody else? I have one other question, and I don't know if you know the answer or it's not important, but why did pewees and Empids diverge and form different family structures? I mean, I don't know. I'm just curious. They're so similar, but they seem to be so different.
Oh, well, I don't know. That's question would have to be answered by a real ornithologist. I'm a non-professional ornithologist, but I think maybe even they won't ultimately know. Do any of us really know? But they're all part of this giant family of flycatchers, the Tyrannidae, and like other, like unlike the warblers, they look so different. They diverge. They have different colors, and you look at these flycatchers or pewees, and you go, "Gosh, how come some of them look so similar?" And yet they diverged. I mean, Acadian flycatcher actually diverged. It's a very different flycatcher, even though we call it an Empid from the other Empids. And so how they differ is in part their migratory patterns, but a lot is the habitats that they nest in are different, and also the microhabitats, how they build their nests are very different. So some have nests that the type of material they use for the nests will be a lot of moss, and some will use just little twigs and fibers. And it's these subtle differences in biology that actually are more striking than their visual differences. They're all insect eaters. I forgot to mention that. And it could be that they feed in different parts of the ecosystem, taking advantage of different niches for different insects. Olive-sided flycatcher, which is actually a pewee, they like to sit way up high in the open, but up high above the canopy and dead branches, whereas yellow-bellied flycatchers down in the shade, very, very shy bird. So they're eating different things.
If there aren't any questions,
Yeah, a quick one. How many? What percentage of the birds that you see, MPs or pewees, do you say, "Hey, I don't know," what percentage do you give up on?
Oh gosh, I don't know if I've ever sat down to quantify that, but so I mean, I'm just going to throw out a guess that I'd say, based on I use iNaturalist a lot because I love. I've got hooked onto iNaturalist for insects, and but I go on sometimes to go and try to ID all the flycatchers on there, and of course some of the photos are horrible. People just put something up, but ignoring the really horrible, impossible photos, yeah, sometimes I'd say 10-15% I will not dare put an ID. I will
That
leave it
makes me
alone.
feel better.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and so like we say in the book and in this intro, we still make mistakes. I mean, I don't want to consider myself an expert, but we're pretty upfront here. We're trying to show you how to identify these things, but they're tough, and we still, Andy, I'm sure would agree with me. There are some birds we leave unidentified. Occasionally, we'll get a bird Andy and we can't agree on, and we say, well, maybe we'll just stay quiet on that. So
Right.
yeah, but you don't have to force yourself to ID every bird. Yeah.
Davey, it looks like you have your hand raised.
Yeah, I do. Yeah, thank you for your presentation. And you did say in the beginning, you don't worry about IDing all the birds. But it seemed like the ones that migrate down from the East Coast, that there are none that really fly across the Gulf of Mexico, right? And so are they not fast flyers? Because I mean, I've heard that hummingbirds will just hover in Louisiana and then just take off and get across the Gulf in like overnight. And so does that mean that like the Empidonax are slower flyers, like they wouldn't be able to stay in flight for that amount of time?
We struggle with this. I don't think anyone knows for sure whether they fly across the Gulf or, but I think for the most part, they don't fly across the Gulf of Mexico. And the reason why I think that is that if you look at the timing of when these birds are showing up, they're showing up along the Texas coastal margin all the way down to South Texas. And then there were some studies, very dedicated studies on these oil rigs out in the Gulf of Mexico, and they basically tracked every bird documented every bird that passed through. And you can see the Empids, they get hardly any. I think they get like half a dozen compared to like thousands and thousands of tanagers, thrushes. And so I think they're not actually great flyers and can't make it across the Gulf, and they go around in the fall. Yeah, I mean, they pass through the great majority of these eastern flycatchers, they pass through Texas and just go down. And the other reason why I think it's mostly circumgulf around the Western Gulf is in Louisiana, some of the Empids are quite rare in the spring. And so the easternmost extent of them coming up is actually here in Houston or High Island. And even in High Island, we don't get them. You might get least, but we don't get in High Island. Yellow bellies starts to peter off there. The alder and willow, and they're very rare in Louisiana in the spring. In the fall, they come through Louisiana. So, but in the spring, Louisiana gets tons of trans-Gulf migrants of the other songbirds, but not so much the Empids.
Yeah, I never considered that because I'm just pretty new to birding, but that birds would rest on oil rigs. It makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah, they if they have something they can land on, they'll rest, or if they're in bad weather, they'll even sit on the boats. Most of them will die, probably, but those are the ones that probably are going to have trouble making it.
Great questions. Well,
yeah, that's a great question. Yeah,
Marcia, you have a question?
I don't have a question, but Cin-Ty, I wanted to offer compliments on your talk. It was really very well organized. And of course, Andy's illustrations are beautiful, but you did a great job with organizing and presenting the material, which, can be confusing, but you did you provided us with a good structure.
Andy and I were kind of joking, like, why did we pick Empids?
Well, I've never taken a geology course, but I'll bet you're a great geology professor.
Oh, thank you.
Beyond any other questions, thank you very much, Cin-Ty Lee. Really appreciate you spending the time with us. Hope your book outsells every other book on the New York bestseller list. And
well,
keep writing.
not maybe wasted in Flycatchers, but
what? People aren't interested in Flycatchers? Oh, well, good luck and keep writing, and we'll follow your literary career as closely as we can. Everybody, thank you very much for attending the lecture. The next lecture is going to be on April 4th, I believe, and it is the speaker we have is Gabriel Foley, who is going to talk about the Maryland DC Breeding Bird Atlas. So I hope to see many of you there if you can attend. Until next time, I hope to see you in the trail.
Thanks, Neville.
Hey, everybody.
Thanks, Neville.
Thank you.
Great
everyone.
presentation.
Thanks, Neville.
Bye.
I ordered your book.
Oh, thank you. Thanks
Marcia
so much.
already told me she wants it for her birthday gift.
Oh, okay. We all appreciate that. So thank you very much. Thanks for having me here to talk. So happy birding.
Yeah, now I'm looking forward to the flycatchers arriving.
Yeah.
I'm not, maybe I am.
It's
Bye-bye.
an acquired taste, but yes.
Yeah.
Thanks so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Good night.
Thanks.